Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Deborah Pyron, a stage captain here at First Baptist, and we are just delighted that you have joined us for this session today. A couple of brief announcements and then we'll get going. The authors will be signing books at the conclusion of the presentation. That is going to take place in the signing tent, which as you exit the sanctuary, it will be just to the left. There will be volunteers directing you to that signing area. There will not be Q&A at the conclusion of the presentation. However, we have books available. If you've been outside, you see numerous booksellers, and we're so happy that Karis Books is our sponsoring bookseller for this particular presentation. So they will be happy to help you with your initial purchase or additional purchases if you've already visited with them. The Decatur Book Festival is a nonprofit. It depends on sponsors and supporters and book lovers like yourselves to support us with donations so that we can continue bringing the hundreds of authors to Decatur each year. You have a couple of easy ways to make a contribution. When you came in, I hope you got one of these little bookmarks. If you didn't, they are available when you go out. But it's got a QR code on it that you can scan that will take you directly to the DBF donation site, or if you prefer, you can go directly to the festival site at www.Decatur Book Festival. Last announcement is if you've got any device that has a ringtone that might be disruptive the next 45 minutes, please locate it and turn off those ringtones or silence them, please. And now I would ask that you welcome to the stage President Lee Zach of Agnes Scott College, who is going to introduce this session.
Good afternoon, and I'm going to ask our panelists to please come up and take their seats. Good afternoon and welcome. I'm delighted to be part of this year's AJC Decatur Book Festival. It's so great to look out and see real people instead of little boxes. So I'm so glad that you're all here. Since its inception, Agnes Scott College has had the privilege of hosting the festival events and is proud to continue that tradition and to serve as a sponsor once again this year. As someone who's an avid reader and a lifelong learner, I'm inspired by the continued success of this event and the ways our community has come together to support writers. This year's theme, Diverse Voices Building Community, is so appropriate for this moment. And this afternoon's panel continues that idea with 3 authors lifting their voices and sharing their unique perspectives on storytelling. As the president of Agnes Scott, it's no surprise that I'm really excited that they're all women authors that we have here today. To begin, I'd like to introduce Nicole Stamant, who will be moderating today's discussion. Nicole is an associate professor and chair of the English department at Agnes Scott. She's also an author and currently working on her latest manuscript. In 2018, she received Agnes Scott's Vulcan Materials Company Teaching Excellence Award. It is also my pleasure to introduce our panelists, Tiphanie Yanique and Anjali Enjeti. Tiphanie, the award-winning author of Land of Love and Drowning, will discuss Monster in the Middle, her electric new novel that maps the emotional inheritance of one couple's newly in love. And spanning more than half a century in cities from New Delhi to Atlanta, Anjali's debut novel, The Parted Earth, is a heartfelt portrait of the long shadow of the Partition of India on the lives of 3 generations of women. Please welcome Nicole, Tiphanie, and Anjali. Enjoy the event.
Hi, everyone. Oh, look, it works. Okay. We are so excited to be with you this afternoon. The Decatur Book Festival is back. I mean, in person. It was wonderful last year too, and it is a special honor for me to be up here sharing the stage with these extraordinary novelists. I mentioned before we came out how lucky I feel to have been able to read these books. They are in conversation with one another so beautifully and in galvanizing, exciting ways. So I hope that you enjoy the conversation. We thought that we would start by having the panelists read a little bit from their novels to give you a sense of the voices that they contain within them, and then we will talk a little bit about some of the connections that we see across the texts. So Anjali, would you read for us first?
Is this already on? Okay. Thank you so much, Nicole. It's such an honor to be here. I've lived in Georgia now for 14 years, and I've attended this festival every year as a reader, so it's really special to me to now be an author here. I'm going to read from my novel, The Parted Earth, which was published in May. It's a book that takes place over 70 years, starting with the 1947 partition in India and Pakistan, and going through to just about the present day, 2016, in Atlanta. And at the heart of the story is an estranged relationship between a grandmother and a granddaughter. Deepa, who is 16 years old and living in New Delhi during the 1947 partition, and her granddaughter, who she has no contact with, named Sean, who lives in Atlanta. Most of Sean's story takes place in the present day when she's 41 years old, newly divorced. But I'm going to read a section from the novel that takes place when she's 10 years old. She is in Agra, in India, with her father, Vijay, who had abandoned her when she was 5 years old, and moved to New Delhi without much of an explanation to his family about why he was moving to India. And so this is a trip that Vijay takes his daughter Sean on to visit the Taj Mahal, and they've not seen each other much since Sean was 5. And this is her first trip to India. They followed streams of tourists down the walkway, their shadows elongated, conjoined. When he squeezed her hand, she felt a tremble in his fingers. "I've really missed you, Shanti," he said. She hadn't heard her birth name in a long time, even on the plane ride over, during their one-night stopover in London, their connection to Delhi. He'd addressed her by her nickname, Sean. She'd adopted it at the beginning of the first grade, not long after he left them. She wanted something easier to pronounce, something that other kids wouldn't make fun of, that sounded more in tune with her last name, her mother's name, Johnson. Sean could be short for Shauna. No one needed to know the truth. But she liked how he said Shanti right now, how it rolled off his tongue, how the TH became something harder, sharper, something so different than the way her mother used to say it. "I missed you too, Daddy." It slipped out by accident, Daddy. She couldn't remember ever calling him that, not even when she was little. He'd always been Dad. Besides, she was almost 11 now, way too old for Daddy. Visitors spilled onto the terrace, pointed to the monument, flowed toward the main entrance. She and her father fell in line, inched forward until a surge carried them through a short, narrow doorway of the building. She envisioned rows of armor, shields belonging to knights, scepters made of gold, red, plush carpet, portraits of royalty. Instead, it was pitch dark. Cool, shuffling feet echoed around her. She blinked her eyes, found herself in a single room with a vaulted ceiling. At its center, a marble lattice fence enclosed 2 long, narrow boxes. She wove her fingers through the grid, peered through the spaces. "Here they are," he said, "the Queen Mumtaz and the Shah Jahan," her father whispered. "What do you mean?" "They're resting here together for all eternity." These are coffins? Her hand dropped. She stepped back. She pressed her face into her father's shirt, tried to shake the images of withering skin and bones from her mind. Shanti, are you okay? He raised her chin, narrowed his dark eyes. She saw in them the pain of disappointing her again, of falling short as a father. Can we please go back outside? She asked. He nodded. They worked their way quickly around the perimeter and exited where they entered. Let me show you something else, he said. He led her around the corner, pivoted her body, directed her gaze along the banks of a shallow river. See there? It's called Agra Fort. In the distance, red cylindrical towers kissed low-lying clouds. Walls like decorative curtains strung them together. That's the place where Emperor Shah Jahan ruled India, he said. When Mumtaz died, he built the Taj Mahal here so they could watch over her from Agra Fort. When he died, they entombed him here with her. He paused. Isn't that a lovely thought? He never wanted to be away from his wife. The truth of his statement stung. The emperor had never wanted to be away from the queen, but her own father had gone as far away from her and her mother as he could. I never knew my father, he said, his gaze locked on hers. Did I ever tell you that? The words fell out of his mouth, landed with a thud between them. His father, her grandfather. She knew this, so how she came to know it escaped her. She always seemed to know about his father's absence in his life, much the same way she always knew of her own father's absence in hers. I've no idea what he even looks like, he continued. I think about him every day, though. Why don't you try to find him, she asked. I can't. The only information I have is his name. He had seemed oblivious to the fact that they shared this kind of sadness of missing fathers. She wanted to shake him in that moment. His decision to move to India without her had been a selfish one. He still did not see it as such. 5 years into his relocation, was wholly unaware of how his absence continued to hurt her, how it made her feel so lonely. For her 8th birthday, he had mailed her a globe. The earth parted by latitudes and longitudes, oceans and continents. She had measured with her hands the distance between Seattle and India. 9 hands, the sun never shone on them at the same time. He had moved so far away from her, he might as well have moved to the moon. When he lifted his face, his gaze traced the horizon, settled back on Agra Fort. Nothing makes me happier than having you here with me now, he said. No one has ever meant more to me than you. She smiled the first of the day. If these rare moments were all they could ever have together, maybe it would be enough. Thank you.
Thank you, Anjali. It's a beautiful, sprawling, wonderful novel. Tiphanie, can we hear from Monster in the Middle?
Hi. Oh, this is on? Yay. Good afternoon, everyone. And thank you, Anjali, for that wonderful reading. Thank you, Nicole, for your moderating of this. And thank you to the institutions that made this possible. I feel like we sometimes forget how important really solid institutions are. But thanks to First Baptist and to Emory and to Agnes Scott for your support of this event. And thank you guys all for coming. I'm really excited to be here. This is actually my first reading for the book. It comes out on October 19th. There are copies available, but they're kind of like cheap copies. So they're like real legitimate copies, but they have a slightly different cover on them. And this cover has the Book of the Month little seal on it because Book of the Month chose it for October. So you can get it earlier if you buy it here. That's my little plug for myself now. And for a feminist bookstore because you should totally support Charis Books. So Monster in the Middle is set all over the United States. And I go from California, I stop in many different places along the course of the book. I go all the way to the Caribbean, parts of the Caribbean that are the United States, like the Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico. And it begins in the 1980s and takes us up right until the beginning of the pandemic, so 2020. And the concept of the book is that all of us, we learn how to be intimate, we learn how to love from our parents and from the stories that our parents told us or from the things we watched on TV. We don't learn it just on our own. And this novel is attempting to sort of map those knowings, to think about how do two people come to know each other? How do they come to fall for each other? We sort of think you love who you love, but I kind of think that I was about to curse, that that's nonsense. I wanted to say something else, but we're in a church. And I think like who you come to love is as political and historical as anything else that you do. In this part of the novel, one of the main characters, whose name is Fly, his house where he lives with his parents, he's an only child, has just been broken into. And his parents think that, along with many of the other things that were stolen, they think that this tape that they made of themselves being intimate was stolen. And it turns out that it was actually taken by their son, Fly, and that he's had it in hiding for about a year already. And so he now has to cope with this recognition that he is the one who has this tape, and that his parents don't know that. And so I'm just going to read what happens in the wake of that. That night, I woke up at like 3 a.m. or something, with the magazine, the porno magazine, on my chest and my dick in my hand. I'm in a church. Is this okay? I was scared to shit because I knew my mother sometimes came in to check on me while I slept, but I remembered that I'd barricaded the door. I put the pornos of the black girls back in the shoebox. I stayed awake until my bedroom curtains turned light from the rising sun. So that next day, that morning after the break-in, my father stayed home from work. I got ready for school. He had a rough night, my mother said, with her face cold. Usually this meant that Dad's pills weren't working and the voices were waking him from sleep. Even then, Mom always said we, like she heard the voices too. But today was different. She was working on that monster quilt that she could never finish. I swear, my procrastinating is entirely her bad example. Though if you were to ask Mom, she would say that all my lame traits come from my father. So that morning, I picked up a marble from my jar and I slipped it in my pocket. I wanted something hard to touch when I faced my parents. In the kitchen, Mom presented me with the usual brown bag with lunch, but I felt strange now. She knew about the video. Maybe she knew about me, you know? I don't want the lunch, I told her, unable to look at her face. Well, I guess you're all grown up now, she said, a sourness in her voice. She turned and dropped the bag in the garbage. When she left the kitchen, I opened the can and plucked the bag out. I hid it inside my jacket as I headed out. I guess I was ashamed of my hunger, or something like that. I started the car. Today, I would drive myself to school, by myself, first time. My father's 4-gallon termite sprayers were heavy in the trunk. It didn't dawn on me until after I parked the car at school that I could have taken the stupid tape, dropped it in the school dumpster. How dumb could I be? But I guess I had other things to worry about. Like I decided I needed to get a job immediately, needed to be able to buy my own lunch without asking for allowance. A metaphor, you know? It was either hang myself from the locker room showerhead or get an after-school job. But I didn't know how to get a job, really. I spent quality time with myself in the boys' room all through Algebra 2, hearing my father's voice in my head from the tape. I don't like being rushed. I don't like being rushed. I sat in the stall, thinking, taking my time, ate the brown bag lunch right there on the seat. That night, I came home late, like after dinner time. I walked into practically every establishment in Greater Atlanta that didn't have a rectangle of the Confederate flag in its window. I wanted a job that would make me feel valued, but I rounded up a stock boy position in a small grocery in Decatur. There was a package store on one side of it, but a church on the other side, so I figured I was okay. A white girl my own age did the super short interview, then yelled out to her boss that I was the best they would get for the price. She showed me around, offered to share an actual spliff of marijuana. I watched her roll and lick it herself like she was an expert. "Do you think Sarah Palin is hot?" she asked me. I could tell she wanted me to say yes. "Yes, I do," I said. It wasn't a lie. I mean, all women were hot to me. I didn't even know who Sarah Palin was then. Then me and this girl went out to the back door and smoked the spliff down to our fingertips. I got paid one $10 bill after 2 hours, lunch money. At home, there was a new magnet on the fridge. This one just said, "Yes, we can." I knew it was about the election, but I looked at it for a long time, looked at it until I was sure it was also about me. Down the hall, my room was still untouched. The tape was there beneath the Man of God Bible where I hid it, which was beneath the white girl porno magazines, which was beneath the black girl porno magazines. I know because I checked. And well, I did more than check. I kneeled to the boxes. This time I popped 2 gummies in one gulp. Then I went to the bottom box. I took out the black girls, and there were the white girls. I looked at the cover of that one for, well, some time, just looking, then deciding. Then I did. I opened the page to all that yellow hair and peach skin, and I found the worst of them. Everything stuffed everywhere. And I imagined like I was one of Dad's Hindu gods, but with many dicks instead of many arms. And at the end, I was sure I'd made a loud noise, and so I got real quiet, listening to hear my mother. But the house just listened right back. "Pray for me," I said out loud. But I didn't. I didn't pray for myself. Thank you.
Thank you. There's nothing quite like having authors read their works in these voices that are in their minds. So thank you to both of you. We are, of course, here in Decatur at the wonderful Decatur Book Festival, and Atlanta and Decatur feature in both of these novels. So I think it would be great to start our conversation by thinking about this space, about Atlanta, and about what it means for you as you live and work and write here.
That's a great question, Nicole. Thank you so much for asking it. I've been living in this area. I live in Johns Creek with my family for about 14 years, as I mentioned. But before I moved to this area as an adult, I grew up primarily in Chattanooga, Tennessee, which had a very small but vibrant Indian population. But not necessarily a whole lot of Indian stores. And so my family and I used to come down to Atlanta, to Decatur, to do shopping for Indian food, for example, or any other sort of clothing or goods that we needed. So this particular area has been very much a cultural touchstone for me. Where I live now, in fact, there is an enormous South Asian population. In Johns Creek, we are now a majority city with a sizable Asian population in general, but also a lot of other sort of racial and ethnic diversity. So for me, having Sean as an adult living in Atlanta and working in Atlanta and building her life here really sort of represents for me a very racially, ethnic, religious South that I don't think people who don't live in the South see very often. We are a region of the United States that is very heavily stereotyped. Georgia in particular, we deal with a lot of sort of negative comments about the people who live here, what our sort of socio-cultural, religious backgrounds are, what our political beliefs are. And so I wanted to sort of show homage to the very long cultural connection that I've had to this area, which is also an area where, I'm raising my own children, but also sort of counter the very negative stereotypes that the rest of the U.S. has in this area. Asian Americans as a whole, when I say Asian American, I'm including, of course, everyone from China to the Philippines to Pakistan and India. This community makes up 4.5% of Georgia. A smaller number is Indian American, but they have a very long history here in Georgia. So it was important to me to write about a place that I love and where I feel like I've raised myself as an adult and am raising my children now, and of course have been working as a writer for many, many years, but also have the book sort of reflect a very long, diverse history here, including the Indian American population that has been here for many decades.
Yeah, it's so important. And of course, in Monster in the Middle, well, of course, I got to read it already. You'll see. Fly goes to Morehouse. He's in Atlanta. He's a Morehouse man. Can you talk a little bit about how you see Atlanta working in the novel?
So I feel like the novel, in some ways, pulled me to Atlanta because I wasn't living here or even dreaming of Emory, where I'm now a professor, at all. I just wanted to find a place where there was a rich Black history that was also a city in the United States that maybe wasn't being focused on in the literature that I was reading. And so I wanted to just find that place. Atlanta is like Black Mecca, let's do it. But I really didn't know much about Atlanta, so I came here a couple of times to do research. Fly lives in Ellenwood. I wanted to live in a certain kind of area. His dad is like a bug man and like goes around to different institutions, like getting rid of roaches and stuff. So like, where would those people live? Where would he go to college? Where would be the hip place for him to want to hang out and get a job at a grocery store? Things like that. So I was just visiting here doing research for the book. And this story that I just read to you from was published and was a story in the world long before I even applied for a position at Emory. So I just feel like in some ways it's like the magic of being an artist. Like I kind of called myself to Atlanta. It turns out that unbeknownst to me, I'm from the Virgin Islands, and I grew up there. So I didn't really know much about our diaspora since I grew up there, right? But it turns out that Atlanta hosts the largest Virgin Islands diaspora. And I didn't know that. But now when I'm in Atlanta, I used to get really excited to see people with little squares of the Virgin Islands flag in their car. I would literally like pull into people when I was driving to like, I'm from the Virgin Islands too. And they'd be like, yeah, we all are, go away. And it turns out that because Virgin Islanders are, we have phenotypically can look like any race. Like Virgin Islanders are Black, Virgin Islanders are white, Virgin Islanders are South Asian, Virgin Islanders we can look any way, as most Caribbean people do, that we're kind of an invisible people. Like we come here and we just sort of integrate with African Americana or with like Asian Americana or whatever. So it's actually been kind of exciting through this book to sort of reimagine my Virgin Islandsness, but also to reimagine like my Americanness very much. Like what does it mean to be an American who's from this place called the Virgin Islands? Yeah.
Well, and this question about national identity, Americanness, is something that both of the novels across the span of the decades that they cover both of the texts are really fundamentally interested in interrogating and exposing and exploring. I'm curious to know how you all see the work that you do in these novels in particular, but maybe more expansively, as working against a kind of historical amnesia, that you are working to preserve stories, you're working to preserve memories and cultures, and make visible what is often invisible.
I'll take that first, and I'll say that Mars in the Middle is sort of a meta story. It's a story about the importance of stories. So the characters themselves are actively telling each other the story. So in that chapter, Fly is telling a future character this story, and characters have been telling Fly stories. So the idea of stories themselves, and as humans, as sort of walking archives that we must all be attentive to, is a big part of the novel. But I also think that one of my overarching things in the book an argument I'm trying to make is that love itself, and romantic love in particular, often gets short shrift in serious literature. And the idea is if you're going to read about romantic love, you're going to have to read something ridiculous that you might want to cover up and not show your friends you're reading. It's not literary to write about love. And I just thought that's BS. And I also wanted to push against the sort of history of literature that says that writing about love and the trials of love and the desire for love is not serious. That's not serious literary work. And I feel like anybody who's ever been in love knows it's probably the most serious work that you are up to. And so I wanted to really emphasize that. And that's one way that I'm pushing against the grain, in particular for Black literature. I feel like when we see Black people in text, and not all my characters are Black, but the two main characters are, we often think that literature should always be about pain and resistance to pain. And that's important literature. But I also think we haven't had enough books that are about what does it look to just be in love and to fall in love? And having beauty is as important as facing the pain. So in that way, I'm also trying to write against the sort of stereotypes.
That's such a great question. So the driving force of my novel is the character Sean, who is trying to find her grandmother and her roots. But she's also trying to connect with her heritage. When her father abandons her when she's a child and then later dies when she's 11, she's raised by her white mother because Sean is biracial. And so not knowing any ancestral history, but also not even knowing her Indian heritage is part of her quest. It's the motivation for her. But at the center of the story is also a fictional archive, which is based on a real archive. In the book, it's called the Partition Project, which is an organization whose mission is to collect stories from the survivors of the 1947 partition. This was a historical event that resulted in between 1 and 2 million deaths and the migration of 15 million people. It is actually the largest human migration in the world. And it's the Partition Project, the fictional version in the novel, which is what ends up linking Sean to the family members that she's been missing all of these years. And I want to put a plug in right now for the actual archive that this is based on. It is called the 1947 Partition Archive. It was started around 2010, 2011 by a wonderful woman named Gunita Singh Bala, who started the archive because she had family members who had lived through partition who were, due to the trauma of the moment, not able to really share their stories of what they lived through. And this archive exists today, and it makes a lot of these survivor stories widely available online. And it was important for me to make that central to this novel because almost 7 decades passed before there was a formal, widespread effort to collect these stories. Events like the Holocaust or the nuclear bombing in Hiroshima, not nearly as much time passed before there was an effort to collect survivor stories, but unfortunately with partition that was not the case. And so it's the archive that actually ends up becoming central to the novel.
Well, and what you're saying, the archive is is central to the novel. It's central to your work, right? Both of you are fundamentally invested in characters telling their stories and what it means to be able to testify, to experience, and also to be listened to. You know, that recognition on the other end, the active listening, the humanity that's central to being able to testify. In thinking about the archives, I'm also curious to know how you all see the art that you make as not just adding to the archive, but as shaping the archive. These are complicated stories that you're both telling, and the structures of the novels are complex. We have origami that shows up in The Parted Earth. There is the monster quilt that happens along with the marbles and sort of the stuff of memory and the stuff of loss. I wonder if you see yourselves adding to that stuff, not just accumulating, but with the substance of the novels, or adding to that archive through these stories.
Well, I would love to be able to flatter myself and say that I am. Fiction is such a wonderful medium to work in because, when we think of fiction, we often think of made-up information, right? I mean, we are writers using our imagination to tell stories, but of course, fiction has a way of revealing the truth, just like all art does, right? I mean, we can talk about, in my novel, origami plays a central role to sort of revealing the story. There is a metals sculptor in the book, there is a poet in the book, and they are all using art in order to first heal from traumatic events, but also to tell their own story of survival and to document their own history as people. But certainly, I would love to think that archival information, we can think of it in a broad concept that includes sort of any artist's attempt to reveal truths of an era, right? Regardless of whether they are nonfiction, certainly, but also in the form of novels and stories. I mean, we are all seeking to tell truths, whether or not they involve our imagination.
Yeah, I love this question, and I really, really wanted Anjali to go first so I could hear how smart she would be. And that was so smart. Thank you. I'm a part of a group of 4 women. We're called the Virgin Islands Studies Collective, and it has come to be that we do a lot of our work within archives in the Virgin Islands. We're all from different disciplines. I'm the writer, there's a visual artist, there's an anthropologist, and there's a philosopher. And we started out just wanting to do research on the Virgin Islands, and then it turns out that our archives, because we're colonized, are all over the world. So our previous colonizer was Denmark, so our archives many of them are in Danish, written in Danish and just living in Denmark. And then we are now American, so a lot of our archives are up here in the States in different parts. Some of them are in the naval museums, which you really can't access unless you have special permission. So if you live in the Virgin Islands, accessing archives about yourself is almost impossible. You have to get a plane ticket, and then maybe you have to be a professor to go and get the special access to it, right? So it turns out that because I'm a professor, I have this access, and I can do this work on behalf of the Virgin Islands. And I think a lot about how this book is maybe also part of the Virgin Islands archive and the American archive, and how thinking about this very particular way to be American that many Americans don't ever think about. A Virgin Islander, somebody from St. Thomas, is an American by birth. But when you go to St. Thomas, you might not feel like you're in America. And when St. Thomians, which I am one, come here to America, we experience it as immigrating. We don't always feel like we are seen and accepted, especially if we're using our accent, which I'm not doing now because I've been trained not to. Then are we part of the team? Are we part of the family? So for me, the book is in many ways uses the archive, but also thinks about itself as an interjection into the archive, as a way to think about what does it mean to be American. I know that this book will be found easily in like the African American studies parts of the library or the bookstores, but I'm really excited for you to maybe stumble on it by accident in the American literature part, right? And to have to like think about this other way of Americanness. So, yeah, I also just dig archives myself. They're so much fun, and our homes are archives of our whole histories, and walking around Emory's archive was probably one of the things that sold me on working at Emory. I was like, oh, damn, they got this amazing Rose Library. I want to work here. Because they're fun, and it's an exciting way to learn about where you've been and where you might be able to go.
Yeah, I agree completely. I'm thinking about the ways in which we archive our particular current moment too. And so these, as contemporary novels, both kind of hot off the presses in the last few months or just about, allows us to think about how we understand our current moment. With our last moment as a group on the stage, we just wanted to talk a little bit about loss. At Agnes Scott, we lost a colleague in the writing community recently, the poet Camila Aisha Moon. So, a lot of what many of us in this community have been thinking about over the last 10 days is, how we make a mark and how we negotiate loss and belonging and posterity. Do you all have any last words? Anything to go out on?
I would like to say something about Camila Aisha, who's a professor at Agnes Scott, and was not a good friend of mine, but someone who I have been rolling with in the poetry world for over a decade. And we've shared bread together many times. And one of the sadnesses of being human is that loss is always part of it. It's one of the sort of beautiful grieving that we must go through. The longer we last, the more loss we will experience. And I do think that the body is also an archive, right? Your own body is a registry of all that you have lived, whether the scar you had when you were 5 that's still there, or the fact that your hair is a different color than it was when you were 17 because now you've aged, and that's also a symbol of where you've been. Our bodies are archives, and when we lose a body, we have lost something tremendous about what that body could tell us about ourselves and about where that body has come from. So we are lucky in that Camila Aisha was a poet and we have her books, but we have lost her physical presence, and that in itself is an incredible loss.
One of if there is any sort of positive, I think, to come out of loss, especially in the last couple of decades, is that I feel we have this wonderful tool now, the internet, where we can sort of have collective conversations about loss, where we can honor people who we lose, and we can archive, anything that they've done online. It's more accessible. I think as a result, our collective grieving of people is more accessible to everyone. I mean, Camila Aisha, for example, online, it was really beautiful to have, an instantaneous opportunity to read tributes about her work from so many writers and artists and students whose lives she impacted. And I think about that in terms of archives in general. I mean, here we now have, it's not just in a university academic library where you have to be a part of that community in order to read about people who had extraordinary lives and extraordinary experiences. We do have more of an opportunity to do that on social media, on the internet, and to learn about people we might not have known about. So that's something that I've just really appreciated.
It's a wonderful way to conclude the conversation. We get to be together in this beautiful space, thinking about literature, thinking about community, and thinking about joy, the joy that comes through living, which of course includes loss. I hope that this was fun. It was certainly fun for me. Please join me in thanking our panelists.
Thank you.